Thank you very much. Dear President, dear colleagues, dear graduate students, I would like first to heartily thank President Renaud de Husse for this invitation to the conferring ceremony of the EUI that brings me back to some 30 years ago when, for some years, this place was my place. In fact, I'm here as a speaker, but first of all, as an alumna, most of all, as an alumna. One of you, dear graduate students, who have just graduated, earned your Ph.D. or LLM. My Ph.D. dates back to some 30 years ago, but I don't feel nostalgic about that. I rather feel very much grateful to this institution and to all the people I met during those rich and unique years. Among others, President de Husse, who was in the jury of my defense, of my thesis, was very demanding. And I even remember that there was a point that you made that was so true that there was not enough comparative law in my PhD thesis. And that's true. But at that moment, it was difficult to widen the scope of the topic of my subject. But anyway, it was a great experience. Professor de Husse, Bruno De Witte, Joseph Weiler, among others, were really wonderful mentors and professors. And the relationship with those colleagues and professors are still very meaningful in my present, in my everyday life. Some of them have become strict friends. Some others are estimated and dear colleagues. With some of them, I've kept strict relations and share many academic projects. With some other, I have only occasional exchanges, but nothing has gone lost. What I learned, the people I met, are part and parcel of my present. I still feel part of the great network of the EUI, and I wish you the same for your future. My mindset as a jurist and my approach to law took shape and still bear the imprint of the cultural environment of the EUI. Let me highlight some out of many legacies of the EUI in my professional and personal life. First and foremost, I was pushed to cross the national borders and to open up to the European dimension. To be more precise, I learned the importance of working across frontiers, in between, on the bridge between the national and the supranational. Please consider that at that time, in the Italian legal scholarship, law was still a very national domain, with the exception of some specialists of international law and some pioneers in European law and comparative law. All genuine and respected lawyers were expected to work in a national horizon. I was interested in constitutional law, a branch where the national dimension was the only option. Some experience abroad were well considered, especially in Germany, but only in the limits of a short digression from the main path that remained national. My decision to apply at the EUI for my PhD was a kind of heretical choice, but supported by my Italian mentor. I took a traditional topic in constitutional law, the so-called eternity clause of the Constitution, or if you want, the unamendable constitutional clauses, But following the suggestion of my supervisor, Bruno De Vitter, a wonderful person to whom I feel very much obliged, I put the topic in a European perspective. And the result of that research was a contribution, sorry for speaking only to the legal scholars and graduates, but the counter-limit doctrine, something that many other national constitutional courts in recent years apply under the name of identity review or ultra-vires review. Unfortunately, not always in a very constructive way, as we have all seen in the past few weeks. The debate about a constitution for Europe was in the air at the time, and the idea of constitutional pluralism as a trademark of the European Union was at the center of many conversations, workshops, conferences here at the EUI. The doctrine of counter-limits was a component, and not a minor one, of that discussion. Why am I remembering all this? Because many, many years later, I had the honor to sit as a judge in the Italian Constitutional Court at the time of the Taricco saga, well known to all the jurists, a case in which that doctrine, the counter-limit doctrine, was developed and applied, I would say, in a very constructive way, in a strict dialogue with the European Court of Justice. Please, let me stress it and repeat it aloud, in a constructive way. I know very well that the doctrine of counter-limits or identity review or ultra-vires review is double-sided. It can be applied to draw red lines in a movement of retreat, but the Italian experience proves that it can also bring fuel to the construction of Europe. That was my experience at the Constitutional Court at that time. In front of a constitutional conundrum concerning the rules of the statute of limitation, a nightmare in my professional career, also as a Minister of Justice, the Italian Constitutional Court decided to take a very unorthodox move, because the court, it was one of the first time, decided to ask a preliminary ruling to the European Court of Justice in order to facilitate a shared position on an issue that could have opened to a major conflict. It was a story with a happy end, a good example to be followed, I would say, and I'm very proud of it. Crossing the borders is always fruitful. Europe, as Paul Ricoeur vividly says, is, quote, the result of interweaving of strong, extraordinarily heterogeneous traditions. The Greek, the Latin, the Jewish, the Christian, the Middle Age, the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and so on. From the geographical and the historical point of view, he and many others stress that, quote, Europe is not defined by borders, and rightly so. Europe is rather a space of intersection between conviction stemming from intensely rival traditions that produces the living present of a culture, a mobile culture, thanks to the spirits of critique that was mentioned also by Professor De Huss, which is nourished by the narrative of the others. A plurality of languages and traditions, a space of encounter with the other, a vivid spirit of critique generating a living culture. This is the European atmosphere that I found at the EUI. In this cultural atmosphere, I've learned and experienced the richness of this living cultural pluralism as a distinguished feature of our common European house, where national traditions are living resources, critical memories, narrative of the others, rather than mere deposits or repositories to be preserved. As an academic, as a teacher, as a constitutional judge, as a minister of justice, I've always experienced the creativity of this spirit of the frontier. Make no mistake, not the inward border, but the outward frontier. Firmly rooted in the Italian context and yet always traveling in a physical sense and in a cultural sense to and fro across the borders, heading to a broader horizon. Let me provide you some example also taken from my present experience as a Minister of Justice. In the past 8 months, since the Draghi government took office, a broad program of reforms was designed and began to be implemented in Italy. And the administration of justice was one of the main chapters of this ambitious program of reforms. The Civil Procedure Act was reformed, the Criminal Procedure Act was reformed, new legislation on the insolvency, the modernization of all the judicial system was initiated by means of investment in digitalization, human resources, and new facilities. A call for 8,200 law clerks was opened, and more than 66,000 of Italian young lawyers applied. The idea of the law clerks in the Italian system was new, except for some experiments, and indeed the inspiration was drawn from other countries where the law clerks, les assistants judiciaires, and other similar figures are essential component of every court. I consider that this part of the reform is the most relevant one that can change the face of the Italian judiciary. A spirit of, let's say, reconstruction is in the air after the deep crisis of the pandemic. And Europe is the boost for this impressive move. Europe is the soul of this laboratory for many reasons. Indeed, first of all, for the big amount of funds that Europe has made available for the investments. But second, not for importance, for the attitude of resilience and the decision for a reconstruction that the recovery plan has triggered in Europe and in each member state, and in Italy for sure. The pandemic is indeed the most tragic event in our history since World War II. And yet, Europe has promptly reacted with the ambitions to emerge stronger from the pandemic, as the presentation of the recovery plan says, to emerge stronger. The original spirit of solidarity among the peoples of Europe has been rediscovered by the European institution in the middle of the deepest crisis ever. Crisis. After all, crisis is at the very core of the origin of the idea of Europe. Europe, as we know it today, arises from the ruins of World War II. It was the urge of reconstruction, the demand of peace and prosperity after the war that prompted the European construction. Later, a number of other crises have marked a new step and stages in the process of the European integration. In recent years, we can just mention the financial crisis, the public debt crisis, the migration emergency in 2015, and in the last 20 years, a number of terrorist attacks. No surprise then if another president of this institution, he was the president when some 30 years ago when I was here, Yves Meny, wrote, "L'Union européenne est largement associée à l'idée de crise." This phrase can be read in two different directions. It can suggest that the European Union is on the edge of a decline. But it can be read also in an opposite way. Let's borrow from Sabino Cassese. He uses eloquent words. He says, Europe lives on crisis. L'Europa vive di crisi. Meaning that crises are an essential element of the European history. Crises hurt. However, as to Europe, crises have also been a major trigger of change, and this is one of the most important features of the European character. Crisis has the same root of critique in the semantical domain of judgment. Therefore, crisis can be an opportunity for a critical revision of the past in order to make a change towards a new direction. To borrow from Reinhard Koselleck, crises are dynamic phases of the historical consciousness, which implies a critical revision of the space of experience, the heritage from the past, and the movement towards a new horizon of expectation, hopes and desires for the future. In front of the pandemic, of the unexpected crisis that was brought about by the pandemic, the European Union has triggered a new dynamism in our social life, unbridling vision and courage. And the same is requested to each of us, to each individual, as well as to those who bear public responsibilities. Dear colleagues, dear President, dear graduate students, this is the European culture that I've breathed in this outstanding institution. A culture of diversity, pluralism, dialogue, a culture of resilience, generativity, creativity, reconstruction. I could not have missed this wonderful opportunity to come back to the EUI to say openly and loudly my thanks to this institution, and especially one by one to the maestri I met here. Dear graduate students, I wish to each of you to be active protagonists of this European culture, of this European spirit, whatever your position in the world will be. Thank you very much.
Dear Minister, thank you for this inspiring speech. And now by virtue of the authority vested in me, I admit you to the degree of Doctor of Laws of the European University Institute.